Welcome to Media Path. I am Louise Palanker.
And I'm Fritz Coleman.
We are here to lead you down a scenic pathway dotted with books and movies and music and perhaps the occasional wildflower. So, by way of full disclosure, we are recording this show on Election Day, just an hour before results are due in, which should explain the occasional cracks in our voices. Our guest coming up is best-selling author Peter Carlin, who has written award-winning books about Brian Wilson, Bruce Springsteen, and Paul Simon. But first, Fritz, what have you been watching and reading this week?
Okay, well, I haven't watched this yet, but I'm so stoked about it because we had a podcast that included a member of this person's family, as you know. I'm going to talk about Mank, which is a movie that comes out on Netflix on November 15th. This is directed by David Fincher, stars Gary Oldman as Herman Mankiewicz, who is the brother of Joseph Mankiewicz, and one of the books I talked about on an earlier show was The Brothers Mankiewicz. These are screenwriters and directors and producers, and some of the greatest, most literate and brilliant in the history of Hollywood. Herman is the grandfather of Josh Mankiewicz, who's been on this podcast. He's one of the hosts of NBC's Dateline. Herman was a genius with a lot of demons. He shared writing credit with Orson Welles for Citizen Kane. He was a raging alcoholic, a self-saboteur. This is a fantastic look at how smart but crazy 1930s Hollywood was. Directed by David Fincher, of course. He directed Seven and The Social Network and Gone Girl. Gary Oldman won an Oscar for a Winston Churchill role in The Darkest Hour. It also stars Amanda Seyfried and Charles Dance. I'm stoked about this movie. I'm really interested that they found something this far back in history that they thought would be appealing to a general audience. But you know, if you're interested in the story behind what many people consider the greatest film ever made, Citizen Kane, this is going to be a spectacular film, November 15th on Netflix. The book I'm recommending this week is called Leadership in Turbulent Times by Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential historian. I love this lady. Odd that we would choose this topic. She looks at presidential leadership and how we should raise our expectations of what we expect from presidents in times of trouble. Now, her book, Lincoln, Team of Rivals, was one of the resources that Steven Spielberg used for his movie, Lincoln. Not only did Lincoln not vilify his political enemies and prosecute them later and get the Justice Department to seek them out, he appointed many of them to his cabinet because he was smart enough to realize that many of them had special talents that he, Lincoln, did not have, like Chase and a couple of the other people, and the country would ultimately benefit from them. So, two good choices, a book and a film, Louise.
Yes, I'm interested. Do you know if Josh was consulted on the making of Mank?
He was not. He never met his grandfather. He was very close to his grandmother. His grandfather died young because of his alcoholism. His grandmother is very close with, and the book Brothers Mankiewicz closes with a very poignant passage of him riding around in a convertible in Beverly Hills with his grandmother and how close they were. He was not consulted, but he said the movie is spectacular. They gave him like a coded link, and he and his brother Ben, who's on Turner Classic Movies, were able to watch it, and they both signed off on it being a wonderful piece of history, and many of the elements of which they were happy to admit they weren't aware of. So even they learned something from it. So I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, it's like a visit with Skip Gates down your... You know, this is why I'm so smart. Thank you. Because right. the guy was so self-destructive that, he should have been just completely vanquished from Hollywood, but he was also so damn amusing that he kept getting invited back to the table.
He was brilliant. He was one of the members of the Algonquin Round Table with Dorothy Parker, all these super smart, super funny people. And I after I read that book, I went back and looked at all the movies that Herman and Joe directed and produced, Cleopatra, All About Eve, all these amazing movies. And what you're stricken with was how smart they were. And I thought to myself, there's no way anybody would have greenlit a movie this literate now. And Josh, when I was talking to him about it, brought up a great point. He said there weren't that many movies. People went to watch whatever was released. It wasn't like they had Netflix and Hulu and all this stuff. So people were sort of forced to watch smart movies against their will. And I thought that's an interesting point. But these guys were funny and literate and really, I can't wait to see this film.
Yes, same. All right, so my picks is I'm going to start out on election night thanking some of the programming and some of the folks who have guided us through the past, I'm going to call it 5 years, because last election cycle plus this administration. So I want to just reach out and say thank you to Rachel Maddow, Joy Reid, Nicole Wallace, Lawrence O'Donnell, Chris Hayes, Brian Williams. Fritz, what names would you add to this list?
I wouldn't. You just named 24 of the 20 of the 24 hours of my day right there. As a matter of fact, as soon as I leave you, I'm going to get some bad takeout food and watch those guys do the post-closing polls wrap-up.
It's a really difficult day. This is hard.
Yeah.
So I watched a film over the weekend that just kind of like took me elsewhere, which was wonderful. And it's called Bruce Springsteen's Letter to You, and it's on Apple TV Plus, I guess is the name of the streaming service. It's a documentary from director Tom Zimney, shot in black and white because it's artful and it's Springsteen, so the music is the color. It's a recording studio doc featuring the E Street Band and loaded with full songs, introed by Bruce, poetically speaking to you, the fan, the listener, as he conveys each song's origin story. We also get archival footage, raw honesty, and drone shots of snow-topped New Jersey trees, which serve as a lovely metaphor for time plus friendship equals beauty. The film presents an interesting contrast to the anguished specificity enforced by Springsteen in Zimney's first Springsteen doc, which chronicled the recording of 1975's Born to Run album. There is joy and relief in having created self and in sharing that creation with your besties. It's on Apple Streaming Plus. I highly recommend it. Our guest is a man who has written about Springsteen and many great artists, so please welcome Peter Carlin.
Hey, Pete, so glad you're here today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hope we can do this in an hour. You've written so many interesting stories.
Yeah, I don't know if that's possible, but we're going to cram the course. Peter Ames Carlin is a journalist, critic, and author. Previously a senior writer at People magazine and a TV critic for the Oregonian newspaper. His work has been published in the New York Times Magazine, the Los Angeles Times Magazine, the Times UK, Men's Journal, and the British music magazine, The Word. He is the author of Sonic Boom, The Impossible Rise of Warner Brothers Records, which will be out in 2021, Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon, Bruce, Paul McCartney, A Life, and Catch a Wave, The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson. So, Peter, I want to start by talking about Catch a Wave, which is what led me to discover you and start to binge your additional works. But I want to talk about Catch a Wave and Brian Wilson. In writing this book, you poured through hours of unreleased studio recordings. How did you find them, and what did you discover and learn?
Well, I found them, there's like a network of pretty, let's call them highly motivated fans.
Fanboys?
And girls and, fan folk. And so admittedly, pretty much all of them are boys, but be that as it may. And so when I began to reach out to folks and everything, then I got sort of hooked into this network, and people were very helpful and friendly and began to kind of send me stuff. A lot of that stuff has been officially released in the subsequent 15 years, or whatever it is. And a lot of the rest of it is available on YouTube. If you look up stuff, there's tons and tons of outtakes and bootlegs of this, that, and the other that you can pull down off of YouTube if you feel like it. But the Beach Boys, alone among a lot of other, seem to have produced about as much sort of unreleased material as any other band. I mean, they're alarming. Every time I think that there couldn't possibly be anything else good in their archive, something else pops up, and it's like, oh my God, where did that come from? So it's, there's just a lot of very highly motivated and very sort of, borderline obsessive Brian Wilson fans who,
We'll just call it enthusiastic.
Yeah, quite a lot of intense enthusiasm, and people have developed their collections and stuff.
Yeah, that's really, it's really cool how people go deep, and when they this is what our show is about with me and Fritz. It's like we get obsessed with stuff and we go deep. Go ahead, Fritz.
Oh no, I was just going to say that he's such an interesting character. I want somebody to finally explain to me what this psychological crack was that occurred in his life, and was it a byproduct of his relationship with his therapist? I never understood what happened. But this is a comment I'll make before you answer. I really learned a lot about Brian Wilson, Peter, when I saw the movie The Wrecking Crew. Mm-hmm. And I heard the other musicians talk about his brilliance, mm-hmm. and how other people, including the Beatles, thought that Pet Sounds was like the seminal album ever produced, and how he would come into Capitol Records with all these amazing ideas, nothing written down. He had them all up in his head and just spewed them out and created this astonishing musical magic. So even with all the stuff that happened with his dark journey of the mind, he was a brilliant, brilliant man. Is a brilliant man. I apologize.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's an either or. I mean, I don't think it's despite. I think in some ways it's because. What happens is you get somebody who has probably a genetic propensity for psychiatric problems, and then, but then he's raised in a family that's defined by, his dad's, psychiatric problems, and he inherited his from his dad's. And then you end up, with a guy like Brian, whose brain just doesn't, for whatever, set of organic and nurture reasons, it doesn't work like yours and mine does. I mean, he's capable of visionary thought and creation. But on the other hand, he's also, that comes with an undertow, which is, which began to present itself as it does with people, with the different kinds of organic psychosis does in his early 20s. And that's when you begin to see, his sort of breakdown in the mid-60s. The stuff with Dr. Landy in the mid-70s, and then most damagingly and for a longer period in the 80s, was more sort of a function of not only Brian's psychiatric problems, but also his family's complete inability / unwillingness to acknowledge that he had psychiatric problems.
Well, when you have someone as precious as Brian and as vulnerable, it is interesting the collection of people who protect and nurture and people who take advantage and drive wedges. Yeah. And that's kind of outlined in your book. And I just find it fascinating. It's sort of like the political climate of today. Are we going to heal, or are we going to just further fracture to advance our own selfish cause?
Yeah. The thing with Brian's dad, Murray Wilson, who is sort of both, if you read stuff about the Beach Boys and Brian and Murray now, Murray kind of comes off by and large as the heavy. If you go to see that movie Love and Mercy, which is great in a lot of ways, they have a sort of simple portrait of Murray as just kind of this dark, angry, vicious kind of abusive father. But on the other hand, Murray was also, he loved his boys in this incredibly passionate and yet unfortunately damaging way. And now when you talk to Brian, I mean, the interesting thing to me about Brian and how he expresses himself is that he uses the words love and fear sort of interchangeably. When he talks about songs that he loves, he'll go, "Oh man, that song is scary. I was so scared." And I talked to him about that a lot over a period of a few years when I was working on the book, and then earlier I've been working on some magazine stories about him. And I remember when he finally finished Smile, that sort of, that for long-term sort of legendarily unreleased psychedelic album from the mid-60s that he made with Van Dyke Parks and never released. And it became kind of in some ways, the keystone to this legend of Brian as this genius, but this kind of victimized or, genius who is too beautiful to breathe or, to exist on this planet. And Smile was the album that was too beautiful to exist. And it was a very wonderful legend and myth, and I was enamored of it for decades and decades. And then, and then late in life or in his early 60s, he gets the mojo and decides that he's gonna finish it. And he did. And it was put it together and it was great. It was nearly as great as everybody imagined it was gonna be. And he was rightly celebrated for it. And I asked him what it felt like, because they debuted it on stage in London in, I think, January, February of 2004. And And it went from this myth that had been a cornerstone of his identity to, walking out on stage and performing it in front of several thousand people. And when it was over, we were talking about it, he said that they gave him a 10-minute standing ovation. And I said, well, what was that like? He goes, well, it was scary. I go, well, how could it be scary? I mean, you had done the performance. They loved it. You were being celebrated. How is that scary? And then he thought about it for a second. He goes, well, there's good scary too.
Uh-huh.
And so that's what he's talking about. So Fritz, to answer your question or to circle back to it, I mean, it is that way of thinking that, the guy is capable of visionary thought. I mean, when he talks about writing, the song God Only Knows, Paul McCartney, still has said for 50 plus years is the greatest pop song ever written. And it is, it's beautiful, and beautifully melodic, and the melody and the harmony and the counterpoint and how it all sort of works together and flows, and it's just this beautiful piece of work that's incredibly sophisticated on so many different levels. And Brian wrote, the guy who wrote the lyrics for it is this guy named Tony Asher, who co-wrote most of the album Pet Sounds. And he told me that Brian wrote God Only Knows, the music to God Only Knows, from start to finish. In other words, from the point where there was no God Only Knows to the point where the music was entirely finished, was something that he did in 18 minutes. And Tony Asher was sitting on the sofa in the living room watching him do it, because he handed him the sheet of paper that had the lyrics, which is how they would write. And Brian looked at it and just began to play these chords and hum and whatever. And then it just flowed together like that. And later, Brian said that while he was writing it, he could see angels floating in the air above him.
Yeah, that maybe answers the question about why he considered things scary, because it was sort of out of his hands. It was divine intervention. He was just a vessel for this stuff to create itself. Pretty interesting.
But I think a lot of artists talk about songs kind of just falling out of the air into their hands. I think that's for people, for really creative people, that's a fairly common experience. But I think that, a lot of that stuff isn't necessarily. But I think Brian was doing it on a level that was so, in many ways, technically so far beyond what most people are capable of doing.
Well, I think he feels things more acutely than we do, and so a natural human emotion that we would be like, oh wow, we'd be able to, identify the emotion. For him, fear is the primary emotion because he's just such a raw nerve. And you kind of describe his condition as schizoaffective disorder, and it's on the schizophrenia spectrum, but one can be high functioning. And talk a little bit about that, or what, and your conversations with Brian about what he knows about some of his struggle.
Well, he's lived it. He knows it about as well as anybody, I suppose. But he doesn't really talk. Brian is less. Doesn't really intellectualize things on that level, or at least not in the conversations I had with him. He tends to be a much more sort of visceral person. And I think he's a very bright guy, and in a lot of ways, and on some levels, he's a genius. But he doesn't really express himself or think in terms of. I don't think that he would come to grips with why he's feeling a particular way, or why his internal psychiatry is a particular way. I think that's mostly, he just experiences it and tries to deal with it. I think he understands it to a degree. And I think that since he finally got hooked up with, decent psychiatric treatment and medicine, then it's been a lot more, he's been way more functional. Just the fact that Smile exists now is testament to that, and everything he's achieved in the last 20 odd years.
How was it to have a working relationship with him? Was he forthcoming with his feelings about his life and his past and things like that, or was it a different dance that you would do with someone else?
Oh, it's a different dance. Because Brian is he is very much like a raw nerve. That was my experience of him. Some days when he was relaxed and happy and feeling good, we would have these great talks, and he could get very deep into stuff. And some days when he was anxious about something else, he would just shut down, didn't want to talk at all. So there were moments when we had really great, wide-ranging conversations, and, and he was funny and sharp and all this stuff. And then there were days when he just seemed like a completely different person, and he really didn't want to, to engage with much of anything. And unlike, say, somebody like Bruce Springsteen, who's way more socialized, and has a real, I think that, I think one of Brian's challenges in some ways, well, actually, I don't even know if that's true, but Bruce Springsteen is remarkably sensitive to what other people are looking for in their connections with him. And that's one of his great strengths, not only as an artist, and an icon, but also as a human being, is that he really understands what he symbolizes to people, and he understands how important that is to people. And so, like with fans and stuff, if he encounters somebody and they come up to him, he's really good at being Bruce Springsteen. And a lot of it's really legit. He really does care. It's not, he's not fronting on that level. I think, people who know him and are part of his life and love him and are loved by him, I think he's a little more, he's as complicated as anybody. But, but Brian is very, I think he's good with people when they meet him. I think, he has a way of, there is a thing about Brian that can be very empathic. I think he really does feel what he feels something about people when they walk into the room. And he's a beautiful guy on a lot of levels, but he's also, hugely passive aggressive. And he's, and one of the interesting things that someone said to me is, a lot of the most trying situations in his life were in weirdly recreations of his original distorted relationship with his father. And it almost as if, it's not almost as if, it appears to be very much that he unconsciously recreates that relationship and that scenario, over and over again throughout his life. There's always some heavy figure that he has to who kind of creates this gravity that he has to walk against.
So it's either it's familiar or it's what he believes he deserves.
Yeah, or some combination of those things. But what one person told me, about that psychologist who became so abusive and, and got disbarred and rightfully it was a horrendous situation. This guy said to me, he goes, well, look, even Dr. Landy wasn't Dr. Landy until Brian made him that way. Which I thought was interesting. And I'm not blaming Brian. I'm not trying to blame the victim or anything or say, well, it's his fault or whatever, but it's just that Brian is in many ways, so people sort of see him as, look, there were 3 Wilson brothers and Brian is the only one who's still alive. And he was the one who spent decades on that short list of rock and roll stars that nobody expected to be alive much longer. And here he is. And he's nearing 80 years old and he's still thriving. Nobody would have guessed.
There's something similar in the lives of Brian and Bruce, and that is that they both inherited psychological challenges from their dad. Brian had this schizoid diagnosis, but Bruce inherited a bit of his dad's depression, too.
Well, the dad, Doug Springsteen, was bipolar. And so that was like his problem. When he talked about his inability to keep a job and everything, he was, and the tragedy was that Doug was a very responsive guy and and very concerned about his kids and very loving to his kids, except for the fact that, again, undiagnosed, untreated bipolar disorder. And so, he would go from this incredible, the depression to fits of mania. And I think it was just very, very difficult, probably excruciating to live in his skin for the longest time until he finally, much later in life got connected with these, with medicine.
When Bruce's parents moved to California, I know he internalized that as a loss because he was on his own before he was of age, I believe. Was that possibly a gift, like a freedom to soar?
Oh yeah, in a way, I think that Brian, I think Bruce, clearly he missed his family, he missed his little sister and he missed his mom and dad. He had a more troublesome relationship with his dad, but that was, and for many, many years, I think that was sort of described as, as a generational conflict, in the late 60s, the establishment generation versus the young, long hair rock and roll generation. But honestly, I think as time has gone by, Bruce has come to realize that it had much more to do with his father's bipolar disease than anything else. I mean, I think it was extremely difficult for Doug just to get out of bed in the morning and function. And, and he drank a lot at the end of the day. And I think that was about just trying to escape from the demons that were
self-medicating.
Yeah, self-medicating. I mean, because there was nothing else. I mean, nobody knew what was going on. But, but again, I mean, his love for, I think he found it very, very difficult to express his love for his son, who desperately needed that to be communicated. And what was interesting to me in talking to Bruce about it was that even given the many, many years of therapy that Bruce has had, and, he's a very sophisticated guy, and his deep knowledge and understanding of psychiatric dysfunction, talking about his dad, he still would get angry and talk about, and there was like one moment in particular where he just, kind of snapped a little bit talking about him. And which I found, which was striking. And but it took him a moment to kind of take a deep breath and let it simmer down.
Was it unresolved stuff with his dad, or it just was a bad memory for him?
I think it was just a difficult memory. I mean, I think that I'm sure that they resolved their problems. I mean, one of the interesting things to talk about psychiatric phenomena is that at some point later in his life, Doug had a stroke. And when he recovered from the stroke, it completely, he went from being a man who was completely unable to express his emotions to someone who couldn't stop expressing his emotion. Wow. And the thing is that he became, very sweet, and it became that wall kind of crumbled, and he was much more able to express his love for his children. And, and I think that, I don't know that his life was ever easy per se, but I think that was a nice coda for them. To have him be so expressive with them after all those years.
Can I ask you a question? You've interviewed a lot of people for your book about Brian. This is probably like 100 hours of conversation, but describe the factions of the Beach Boys and what it has broken off into, and over the years, the infighting over this magnificent catalog and these interesting personalities that a lot of whom are and were related.
Yeah. Well, it's here's the thing. The Beach Boys were a family band. There was Brian, the oldest Wilson and most brilliant Wilson brother, his brother Dennis, who was the drummer, who was, kind of the party hardy, handsome guy. But beneath that, he was also enormously talented as a musician and a songwriter. And really, there were glimmers of his talent and moments of brilliance that he showed in his own compositions and his own productions that are astounding, frankly. But he was also, had just, was an alcoholic and a drug abuser and was self-medicating desperately. And then there was the youngest brother, Carl, who was the lead guitar player and sort of the most stable, responsible one, even though he had his moments of trouble with drugs as well. But he really kept that band on the road for 30 plus years after Brian died, until he died of cancer in the late 90s. And Mike Love, the lead, sort of the guy, the singer, sort of the lead singer with the lower voice, and kind of the sort of MC guy in the shows, is their first cousin. And then Alan Jardine, the fifth member, or original member, I should say, is, a neighbor and a friend. But that family, there's the Wilson families, and Mike Love's mother was Murray Wilson's sister. And so he's essentially a Wilson too. And it's a very complicated and in many ways sort of tormented family. And there's a lot of anger between them and a lot of, and so Brian, I think there was quite a bit of jealousy in that family about, who was successful and who wasn't successful, and who got money and who didn't get money. And so there was a lot of static and a lot of, and it's the worst kind, which is the family kind. And so Mike has always been envious of the fact that people sort of fell over talking about the brilliance of Brian, and rightfully so, because Brian's brilliant, right? Mike co-wrote a lot of songs with Brian, but Brian worked with a lot of other collaborators as well. And the one thing, the brilliant thing about the Beach Boys comes from Brian. Mike is really good in a lot of ways and has written some really good lyrics and is, not a bad musician himself. He's a fairly musical guy, but he's also a pretty angry guy. And he has, for whatever reason, lashed out at Brian a lot over the years and has sued him a lot there's a lot of civil litigation that Mike Love uses to, and I mean, then some of it is really just head clutchingly dismaying.
He owns the name now, doesn't he? And he's in charge of the current manifestation of it.
The Beach Boys, such as they are Mike Love's band, but he leases the name. He leases the right to use the trademark. And, and Brian and the estates of Carl, and Carl and Dennis, I think Al Jardine's a corporate member. They all get a certain amount of money from Mike's touring. So they get income out of it. But Mike and that other Beach Boys group, but they don't have any control over what he does. And to Mike's credit, it's like I saw them. It's been a long time. I kind of lost my interest in seeing the Beach Boys first of all, when Carl Wilson passed away, and second of all, when, and at which point Al Jardine kind of got booted from the band, and the Beach Boys became Mike Love and Bruce Johnston, who was sort of a substitute Beach Boy starting in the mid '60s and sort of in and out of the band for most of their career. But he was not an original member, but it's those two sort of with a sort of a rotating cast of musicians who, play the parts and sing the parts and everything. And the thing is, it's like, I don't find, it's all oldies basically. It's not the most artistically challenging thing. But on the other hand, they do a great job of playing a lot of really complicated Beach Boys music. And it's sort of a fun show, I mean, the last time I saw it was probably 15 years ago. But, I prefer Brian's band, because Brian's got this, started touring like 22 years ago, very surprisingly, after years and years of being putatively, too frightened, either not touring at all because he had stage fright, or being on stage and being miserable and, obviously not enjoying himself and not really being a very good performer. And suddenly he transformed himself into like a road warrior, basically.
All right, we're going to take a commercial break, and we're going to come right back. I have a couple more questions about Smile before we talk about Paul Simon.
Great.
Winning season returns at MyBookie. Winning season means doubling your first deposit. Winning season means Survivor, Super Contests, and Squares. At MyBookie, it's time to celebrate the NFL season. Sign up now and make your first deposit to get a dollar-for-dollar match all the way up to $1,000 and grab yourself a free entry into the famed MyBookie Super Contest. To play in the contest, all you got to do is pick 5 NFL games against the spread to have a chance at $100,000 guaranteed cash prizes. The best part is MyBookie has thousands of bets to choose from. The full NFL slate, the NBA playoffs, whatever you need, from live betting to championship futures. Every play you want to make is waiting for you at MyBookie. It's simple. Make your picks. Win big. Collect your dough. Use promo code MediaPath and double your first deposit now. It's a no-brainer. Your winning season begins today only at MyBookie. Weezy, can I just make a comment before you ask him some more of your great questions about Peter? The phenomenon of the Beach Boys to me was that they turned areas where there was no ocean, there were just oceans of cement, like where I grew up, into like surf culture, because their music was so influential that kids were pretending that they were part of the surf culture, and many had never seen an ocean.
And so, thus the skateboard.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, I don't know that there's another instance in music history where anything like that has happened, where they sort of created this fantasy culture out of nothing.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, sort of my sense is, and I've always felt this, is that those songs are, as much as they're set in the world of surfing, they're not really about surfing and cars. It's about fear. It's about anxiety. It's about,
beautiful girls in bathing suits.
Well, not only that, but it's about being alive on the frontier. They're songs of the American frontier. Only by the early 60s, the frontier has been pushed out beyond the beach, but it's still that same thing of having some, taking some sort of physical challenge and proving yourself out on the breakers, don't back down from that wave.
That's
and all
interesting.
that. But it's also, all those songs in a lot of ways are about Brian's hopes and fears, just escaping his family, escaping this, escaping essentially a, some sort of overwhelming and dark-eyed authority, and all
That's
those
very
characters
interesting.
in those songs are, they're escaping something, they're moving somewhere, they're on the road, they're on the beach, they're, and also there's a real interesting just kind of, early 60s optimism to that, to the setting. I mean, the idea, there's a song called The Girls on the Beach, which is one of my favorite early Beach Boys songs. And part of the chorus says, the girls on the beach are all within reach, which is like, well, how democratic could anything be? I mean, it's not, they're not at a beach club somewhere. There's not like any separation between, I mean, some people will say, oh, Jesus, you're really over-interpreting that. But I don't think so. I mean, the idea is if you can get out there with a surfboard and challenge the waves and prove yourself, anything is possible. And there's, these are public school boys coming from a working class suburb of Southern LA, so that was their world, and that was still very much, the New Deal America, that's the Camelot America, the idea that, that this is sort of a meritocracy. And if you can prove yourself, if you can do it, you can be it. And I think a lot of that.
That's really, really interesting.
And I, and it's sort of like I fell in love with the Beach Boys in Seattle in the early 70s. And I don't, obviously there's no surfing on Puget Sound. And second of all, it's like, to the extent that there were cars around, I mean, my dad drove a Mazda, and we were those types of people. I didn't care about cars. It's like I care about a car to the extent that I want to get to the grocery store and back. And I like to have a comfortable car, but I don't want to have a flashy car. It's like, it just doesn't matter to me. It doesn't make any difference to me. But they understood, I mean, I think in a less conscious way than Springsteen did, that these cars are symbolic. I mean, it's freedom. It's the highway. It's the road. It's going anywhere you want to go. It's having, to borrow a phrase, it's having fun till your daddy takes your T-bird away. And there's that authority figure again.
Yeah, there you go. So Brian was haunted for years by the Incomplete Smile Project, and it was sort of like an archaeological dig meeting an emotional, psychological intervention to get that project to blossom. And what are the fears and insecurities that Smile triggered for Brian, and what did completing it mean to him?
Well, I think a lot of the, I don't know that it required a psychiatric. The thing about it is that I think Brian's sense of his music, I think when he asks, well, what are your favorite Beach Boy records, he'll talk about the stuff that are like, that he has fond memories of recording or things that he remembered doing. And I think that because he was falling apart, psychologically in the mid 60s, that, and especially, the Smile Project was the one that coincided with his really, sort of his collapse in a sense, where he just sort of gave up. But I think that a lot of that had to do, my theory was that the reason why his work became so much more sophisticated in the mid 60s was that, there was all this energy going through him, and a lot of, and some of it was creative and good, and he could channel it into being creative and good, but a lot of it was this dark energy, and that he was the recording studio and music was the one thing he had complete control over. And the more that he controlled it, the more elaborate it became. It became like this wall protecting him from the bad stuff in his life. And so the music became more and more complex. He became more and more ambitious, and it got more and more elaborate and more beautiful, until suddenly he just couldn't take it anymore. And then it all blew up. And I think that when he thought about that music, it was like, it became in some ways, I hate to, I don't know if you could compare it to his White Whale or whatever, but I think it symbolized for him the point at which he lost control of his life. And that's not a good memory for him. But I think that, 25 years later, suddenly he was in a position, or whatever it was, practically 35 years later, I should correct myself. It's like nearly 40 years later, he found himself, I think, feeling secure enough and confident enough that he felt like he could open it up. They asked him, they had done that tour of Pet Sounds where they played Pet Sounds from start to finish, which had never been done before. And then after that, and it was a very successful tour, and the question was, what are we going to do next? And they talked him into like, how about performing some of the, some of the Smile music? Like it's not finished, but we can record the parts that were finished enough, or we can perform the parts. And it was like, okay, that sounds cool. So he started getting into it. And then one day, it was just like he was working with the guy that was sort of his band leader, Darian Sahanaja, and they were working on this song called Roll Plymouth Rock. And and Darian, like like me and all these other maniacs, knew all the bootlegs and everything, so he was already pretty familiar with the music. And they get to this part, and he says, "Were there supposed to be words with this?" And Brian goes, "Yeah, there were, because the recordings that exist are just the instrumental track." But he couldn't remember what they were, so he called up Van Dyke Parks, his collaborator, with whom he hadn't spoken in years, and just out of the blue, Van Dyke described it to me. The phone rings one day, and Brian goes, in that song "Roll Plymouth Rock," what's the word after? And Van Dyke just goes like, "Beat it." And he goes, "Yeah, that's right. That's right." Goes, "Do you know the rest of it?" And Van Dyke goes, "Yeah, I can write it down for you." And he faxed up the lyrics. And Brian was like, "Hey, thanks a lot." And it's like, "Why don't you come by tomorrow?" And then they decided to finish it. And they did, and it was this amazing thing. And the interesting thing to me, though, was that so many people, so many of the Beach Boy fans and Brian Wilson sort of super fan types got so sort of swept up and involved with the idea of Smile and the perfection of Smile and all this, that they were put out when Brian announced that he was going to finish it. And I remember seeing, like, on the part of the internet where people would go back and forth and talk endlessly about this. It's like, he has no right to do this.
Oh, God.
And it's like, this belongs to us now. It's not like the Brian Wilson of 2004 could in no way do what the Brian Wilson of 1966 could do.
So I understand. It's like, don't destroy my myth.
Guitar.
It's like, let me live with my, it's like, because any piece of art that doesn't exist is way better than one that does, because there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, it's a concept. It's an ideal.
Yeah. And I think, and there was enough of Smile floating around, and like on these bootleg tapes, like these 6th or 10th generation bootleg tapes that you would get, or, that I would get, and people would get, and you'd listen to it. And some of the recordings were more clear than others, but the ones that weren't, that had static or had skips on them, or it seemed like it was beaming into you from a whole other solar system.
Like you got to decode it, so you became a part of the process.
Well, it was that much more rare and that much more beautiful because it was not of this earth in a way.
Okay.
And so, yeah, and you got to kind of decode it. And what's more, you got to decide how it was all supposed to fit together, what Brian intended. And, and I think part of the reason why people were upset was that it took away their favorite parlor game, which was arguing endlessly about how Brian intended these pieces to fit together. Now there was a right answer and a wrong answer because it was going to exist.
They should pick up the Talmud, because there's a lot of Talmud study groups that they would enjoy. They can get right back into it. I want to switch to Paul Simon real quick before we run out of time, because I'm reading your book, Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon. And I'm going to read the closing paragraph of this book's description on Amazon so that you can grab a copy of this book and get into it with me. It reads as follows: Simon has lived one of the most vibrant lives of modern times, a story replete with tales of Carrie Fisher, Leonard Bernstein, Bob Dylan, Woody Allen, Shelley Duvall, Nelson Mandela, drugs, depression, marriage, divorce, and more. A life story with the scope and power of an epic novel. Carlin's Homeward Bound is the first major biography of one of the most influential, popular artists in American history. And your book brings to life a Paul Simon who is not just a talented singer-songwriter, but also a magnetic personality who has always been compelled and propelled to make exciting and important things happen in his life. So talk a little bit about Paul Simon and his personality.
Well, to me, the thing that interested me the most about Simon, I mean, over and above like how beautiful his music is, how much of his music is so fantastic and everything, and how different it was and how much it evolved from the early 60s through, to today, is it, to me it's a story about identity, and it's a story about assimilation. And, and Paul, like Paul's family, like my family are Jewish immigrants. And a lot of what Paul's, in the Simon family's journey through the 20th century is very much sort of a projection of the Jewish experience in the 20th century, which is all about assimilation, getting into this, and his thought. And it was really fascinating to me, the extent to which people's, and Paul in particular, his sense of identity and how fungible it is, and how they can start. He and Artie started off as like pop teen idols in the mid '50s, and then as the Tom and Jerry, with that "Hey, schoolgirl in the second row," and then 7 years later, there's Simon and Garfunkel, doing "Hello, Darkness, My Old Friend," very different things. But Paul, they grew up. They were 7 important years. They finished high school. They went to college. They're very smart guys. They became sophisticated and got more involved in folk music and politics and all that kind of stuff. But to me, the fascinating thing is that throughout Paul's career, his music career, he has just restlessly moved from this type of music to that type of music, and moving from this subculture to that subculture, and first from teen idol pop in the 50s to rock and roll to folk music to sort of psychedelic pop in the mid 60s to this more kind of, and then he got into reggae and Southern R&B and gospel, and then that kind of New York sort of, modern art music, and then onward and upward until he gets to the South African music, and then
that's what I was going to say. I think his real contribution, like a third act contribution of his career, has been he sort of introduced the world to world music.
Oh, absolutely.
In the album
existed, but he definitely came in hard, and I think transformed a lot of people's sense of the music that was available to them, and also transformed the lives and careers of the musicians that he worked with.
Oh, yeah.
What's interesting too is like he was influenced by a lot of bootlegs that were going around of these different. He didn't even know a lot of times what country the music came from. It was way, way pre-internet. Go ahead, Fritz.
No, I was going to say essentially the same thing. Like Graceland, where he used Ladysmith Black Mambazo. That was our first exposure to like these beautiful a cappella choral pieces from South Africa. I think that's one of the most beautiful albums ever produced, and it was the first time. It was brave and also expensive. There were a lot of people on stage during that period.
Yeah, it's a beautiful record. The problem is it kind of came a little bit besmirched by his sort of inability to, or unwillingness really to reckon with the political ramifications of going to South Africa to do it. And, obviously he didn't go there to take advantage of anybody, and he paid them as well as he could. And he, distributed song credit, writing credits and everything, and helped grow careers for folks. But on the other hand, you can sort of say that, you could do an entire series of episodes about appropriation, cultural appropriation, and what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate, and all this sort of, for people to do what is appropriate appropriation, as we say. But ultimately, I sort of, to me, the interesting thing is the song. A lot of this, the sort of the first major hit single in South African pop music in the 20th century was a song called Mbubi by a guy named Solomon Linda, which is a song that eventually migrated to the West and the United States, and which we became known as The Lion Sleeps Tonight. And Solomon Linda was a Zulu who did this kind of Zulu choral music that was kind of part of the pop music scene of South Africa in the day. But one unintended benefit of imperialism is that, while the Westerners are coming to South Africa to rape the land and take, and pillage and all this and do terrible things, they also brought over their culture. And a lot of that, like they brought ragtime music and early jazz music, and Solomon Linda heard that. And what Mbubi was his weaving together Zulu chants with Western pop music. It was actually African American music to a great degree. And so the reason why Paul Simon, when he finally heard South African township jive and Umbakanga music, the reason it sounded so familiar to him was because the music he loved, that he thought it was, that it reminded him of, which was doo-wop music and early R&B, descended from the same type of music that township jive did. And so there's this so the whole thing is unified before he was even born. And the first South African, one of the sort of discoveries that I made, or realizations I had, is that the very first South African song or inspired song that he recorded was actually recorded in 1961 as a B-side for this band he was sort of producing and kind of performing with called Tico and the Triumphs. And there was, I think it was their song Locomotive or something, and the B-side was called Wildflower, which has this kind of bogus sort of Hawaiian thing, but it's also got this kind of South African sort of lilt to it because he was so inspired by The Lion Sleeps Tonight, the formerly the Mbubi. And to me, that there's a kind of magic in that, and there's a kind of, I feel like, and Paul's a complicated person and a very difficult person in a lot of ways, but I feel like he was as conscientious as he ever gets in terms of trying to share credit with the South African people. And
Yeah, I think he thought that they were the victims of double apartheid. So they lived in an apartheid state, but they also, because of no one was trading with them, they weren't able to get their music out. And I think he felt like art and music should not be blockaded.
Right, exactly. And, but I mean, you end up in a situation where, because of the way that the boycott was worded, there was like a racially mixed band from South Africa who had a hit in England, and they went and they were like, the South African government was constantly shutting down their shows and trying to shut down this band because they were, it was a desegregated band, it was an integrated band, and they went to England to try to get some traction, because their song was getting some interest there. But because they came from South Africa, the letter of the boycott was that they couldn't perform on British TV. And they got all their performances got shut down, even though they were part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Wow.
And I'm not trying to say that, and I'm not carrying water for the South African regime or for apartheid. All I'm saying is it was a very, that there was a certain amount of nuance, particularly with that group, and and the idea that a South African band that does this incredibly radical thing of having black and white musicians playing on the same stage, which was anathema to the South African regime, was still shut down in England by people because of apartheid. That they didn't, so there were a lot of uncomfortable sort of paradoxes taking place.
Before we close, I want to take a look at Paul Simon, Bruce Springsteen, and Brian Wilson. In each case, we see a brilliant kid who had a complicated relationship with a difficult father. Do you see this as a dynamic that will make or break a genius, depending on the rest of the elements of the personality?
That's an interesting question. It's interesting. I mean, you get a lot of, it's like I've written it's so many of the books that I've written and the artists that I've studied and written about always end up sort of being stories about depression, which to me seems, and I think that, I mean, there are difficult dads, and Paul Simon's dad was again, very loving, but also very envious and very, and would say these terribly diminishing things to his son. And I think kind of made it difficult for him in a lot of ways. Does it, I don't know that it's 100% of the time. I mean, Bob Dylan, I think, had a great relationship with his dad, or at least not a troubled relationship. And I think, nothing is, and maybe that's the exception that proves the rule or something. But I think, I think having a certain amount of static in your life, I mean, I think it's a very common thing for artists, particularly artists that people think of as being geniuses, who are functioning on a level that's so far beyond other people in some ways. I think a lot of that comes from sublimating some sort of difficulty, some sort of anxiety, some trouble, some darkness in your life, and your genius is your ability to turn that into light.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, John Lennon said famously, genius is pain, which is to a degree, which is true to an extent. But then you look at somebody like his partner, Paul McCartney, who had a great relationship with his parents, but his mother died when he was young. But Paul, and Paul's ability is, I think he's as much of a genius as those guys, but he wears it that much more, he wears it so lightly. And I think that's why people find him aggravating.
Yeah, he does. That's an interesting observation. People are aggravated by his joy.
Well, it's like Paul, John, I mean, the thing about John's like, oh, genius is pain. And Paul's thing is more like genius is a breeze. and because he can just sit down and whip these things out. And but sometimes you wish he would work harder, but or
Fair
feel
enough.
it more intensely. But on the other hand, what he does is pretty magic. I mean, he's capable of an extraordinary magical thing. So it's like, you got to give it up for Paul McCartney, no matter how easy he makes it look.
Now, do you always have an opportunity to meet and interview everyone that you write about? Is that something that has to come first? That
No.
you're not?
I never met Paul McCartney, for instance, and I didn't really. I had encountered Paul Simon, but many, many years earlier, and just sort of a say hello type of deal. But it wasn't. But the thing is, obviously, in some ways, it's preferable to be able to talk to the people that you're writing about. The book I have that's coming out in January is a thing about Warner Brothers Records, and I managed to actually get to, spend a lot of time with Mo Austin, who was the head of that company, and a lot of the people who were artists and executives at that company. So that was very valuable. But on the other hand, the Paul Simon book, I was disappointed that I didn't get to talk to Paul. But on the other hand, it kind of freed me up. I actually felt weirdly liberated because the story I really wanted to tell was less about his personal life than it was about the larger sort of cultural experience, larger cultural context, which again is this idea of identity. I mean, I think that Paul, personally, he's such a complicated and prickly character. To me, it's much more engaging and much more interesting to think about him in that larger cultural context. And what I thought was really fascinating, again, was the story of identity and, who he is or who he felt he was and why he felt like he could, why it was so easy for him to sort of absorb other cultures and other voices and be able to project them through him, even as he's telling stories about his own life. I mean, the fascinating thing about Graceland is that it's just incredible South African music, but these songs are about living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and living that life, that the whole thing about,
diamonds in the soles of my shoes.
Yeah, there's that one talk about being in the bodega and all that, even though that setting, that song sounds, it almost seems to kind of exist in a fantasy world that's part New York and part Africa. But a song like, I Know What I Know, when he talks about talking to the woman who was given a Fulbright, being at a cocktail party, and, and didn't I see you at the cinematographer's party?
Yeah.
Like, that's not happening in the township, that's happening in the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
I'm going to tell one Paul Simon story because I did get to interview him when Graceland came out. And I don't know if he tells this story a lot. I don't think he gets interviewed that much, so I don't know if everybody knows this, but when he was married to someone named Peggy, they had a party, and someone said, hey, can Pierre Boulez come over? I guess he was the conductor of the New York Philharmonic. So Paul was just like, yeah, he can come over. So he comes over, he stays for about an hour, he has a nice time, and as he's leaving, he's been introduced to Paul and to his wife, Peggy, and as he's leaving, he says, thank you for having me. Goodbye, Al. Goodbye, Betty. And he completely blew it on both of their names, and that's what they affectionately called each other. But I just think a lot of people who sing that song they know it's about some kind of sort of desperate search for your lost life or something, or feeling, I don't know, what is it about to you?
I think he's talking about having something of a midlife crisis,
Yeah.
I mean, a familiar story. You don't have to go to Africa to have one of those, but that was how he set his up. But again, I mean, this idea, you can call me Bob and, or whatever it is, Al and Betty, and you can call me Al. It's like, but again, but that's part of that artistic magic, is being able to take that dark sort of horrible feeling of having wasted your life or not being certain what your life is about, and channeling it into not only a song, but one that's so catchy and oddly life affirming as that one. It's a beautiful, beautiful song and everything. And there's your artist. I mean, taking a random moment that happened to you 15 years earlier and being able to tuck it into the middle of into a pop song that not only that, it's like, it's like a pop song, set to South African music.
And always with Paul Simon, there's that juxtaposition of the music invoking one feeling and the lyrics another. And it's stunning what he's created. And you can listen to it over and over again, and you find yourself there and you find yourself reading something else into it. I mean, I guess if I'm thinking about it, that even someone important doesn't even know his name and the name of his wife after spending time at his house. That's this kind of like this feeling of, am I actually here? Do I matter?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that they made the best of it. I mean, I think they thought it was hilarious, probably if only because Paul Simon at that point, I mean, and has been since he was 23 or 24 years old, has been one of the more famous people in the country. It's like he walks down the street and people are like, "Oh my God, it's you!" You walk into a room and the weather changes.
But still, you're going to think about, but not to Pierre Boulez.
Yeah.
That's all you're going to remember. If you're a comedian, you're going to look and see, because Fritz will tell you, you'll see the one person who isn't laughing. That is all you'll see.
Of course. That's just human nature. I mean, or artistic nature or whatever. But it's like, but if that didn't exist, but that's the whole thing. I mean, what you're trying to do, that creative impulse to a great degree, for a lot of people, I think, is just trying to fill this hole inside. And you keep shoveling art into there and hoping that the money and the applause and whatever is going to make it better. And of course, the problem is it never really does. And either, and hopefully you get to a point where you find something else to stick in there, like your wife and family or something else, or, religion or cocaine. I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously you don't want it to be cocaine, but I think a lot of that, again, I mean, artistic, that impulse is sublimation. It's finding a way to turn darker energy into light. And
it became a song. So that's.
Yeah. Or it became a whole record. I mean, and that's, you see it over and over again. I mean, hopefully what happens is you get to be Bruce Springsteen and carry it more lightly as time goes by. Get those 30 years of therapy and then the right prescription for antidepressants and you can be happier in your 60s than you were when you were in your 30s.
Wow.
Peter, let me ask you one question about your Warner Brothers book. What does Mo Austin say about the future of the record business? Are they good? They're reconfiguring now. Are they going to survive, or what are his thoughts about that?
I mean, I think for one thing, Mo's 93 and he's sharp as a tack. I mean, the guy's, and he was the chairman. For folks who might not know it, he was kind of the visionary chairman of Warner Brothers Records. He helped create this style of record company that was very much focused on the music and the art, and actually put making good records above and beyond making hit records. But what he seemed to intuit, and what eventually, not even all that eventually, what very quickly became clear, was that by making great records, like all the records by Joni Mitchell and James Taylor and the Grateful Dead and Prince and REM, and when you invested in the artists and let them be artists, then you would make records that people wanted to hear. And they very quickly became extremely successful and remained that way for 30 years practically, through many, many different eras of popular music, which is sort of extraordinary. What his sense of it, but I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, I'm like, 35 years younger than he is. I mean, I'm 57, but I feel like anything I might possibly say about the music industry or what I think the new type of pop music is going to be is, I wouldn't want to hear it from me because I'm out of it. That's the sort of stuff for people my kids' age to figure out. It's like, or what the medium's going to be. I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, 20 years ago, who would have thought that that CDs were going to basically cease to exist, and that it was all going to be MP3s. And now maybe MP3s are on their way out. People are listening to vinyl again, of all things. It's sort of, I don't think vinyl is going to become the dominant medium again. But it's difficult. I think for guys like Mo, who came of age in the time and sort of led the industry to a point where people were buying records by the billions and billions every year. It's hard to imagine that the fact that the industry would have evolved to a point where actually buying the records, that you don't need that anymore. You just plug in and it comes at you through the air.
And that's one treat is reading one of your books and then being able to jump on Spotify and listen to exactly what you're talking about in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, in a lot of ways, I mean, the problem is it's sort of, the artist gets dealt out. I mean, at least the way that it is right now, when it comes to streaming and everything, I think, the old problem remains thus, is that the the artist doesn't make nearly as much money as they deserve. And it all goes, if it's not going to the record company, it's going to, to whoever, to Apple or whoever owns the bandwidth, the cellular service and everything. And that's kind of the problem. You end up giving thousands and thousands of dollars to the man, and the artist who creates the art that you love gets nothing. And they say, well, music wants to be free, so you should just perform and sell T-shirts and stuff. And it's like, sort of, it wasn't, I mean, I guess that's the gig now. But it used to be that you could just make beautiful records and everything. But, who knows? I mean, maybe but I'm an old guy, my kids don't care what I think or what I think the problems in the industry are, and good for them.
I think they care deeply. We're going to have to close it and go watch election results. It's like a really tricky day for all of us. And we really appreciate spending it with you, Peter, and taking our minds off.
Thank you so much. What a great conversation, Peter.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Your books are genius. They're brilliant. They're enjoyable. They're informative. They make you think, and they're just highly recommended. And I'm going to continue reading them. I have a few more to go, and then we'll have you back.
Thank you very much.
All right. Here comes the closing credits. We would love for you to join us online on Instagram and Twitter, where we are at MediaPath Pod, and on Facebook, where we are MediaPath Podcast. You can find full episodes with all kinds of bonus visual content on our YouTube channel, MediaPath Podcast. I want to thank our guest, Peter Carlin. Our team includes Dina Friedman, Francesco Damanda, Mosey Masenko, John Maddox, Bill Filipiak, Thomas Hubble, Brian Bennett, and you. I am Louise Palanker here with Fritz Coleman, and we will see you along the Media Path.